Super Nintendo Anti-Piracy. In the last episode on this series, we discussed the different methods employed to stop the pirates from making illegal copies of the games. This was done using disk copiers, which was popular hardware used to dump cartridges to floppy disk, and then utilizing the disk to play the games without ever needing the original. The majority of anti-piracy methods have one or more checks in place, but with the most basic one being based on SRAM or static RAM. This RAM manages the save game data on the cartridge. The amount of SRAM allocated on a disk copier is usually much different in size, so it's pretty simple for the game to check the amount of SRAM that it expects to see, and if it comes up with a different value, an anti-piracy message is displayed. Some games have additional checks. Earthbound would even go as far as deleting your save game if you made it through to the final boss, Gygax. But we really only took a look at a few examples in the last episode. There are more Super NES games that have anti-piracy methods in place.
So, in the first episode, I got a lot of comments about games that I didn't mention that had anti-piracy measures, and some of them that I'd never even heard of before. So I thought it would be a cool idea to take a closer look at some more games on the Super NES and their anti-piracy measures, and see if we can trigger them via emulation.
Demon's Crest is sometimes referred to as a sequel to Super Ghouls and Ghosts, but it's really more of a spin-off than anything. You get to play as Firebrand, one of those annoying demons from Ghosts and Goblins, in his very own adventure. The game itself is pretty cool, and quite a bit easier than Super Ghouls and Ghosts, as you can fly and stay suspended in the air. This means that you can skip over some parts of the level. For example, on the first level of the game, you can just about fly over most of it and go straight to the boss. Demon's Crest has a typical SRAM anti-piracy measure in place. But MVG, I hear you ask, Demon's Crest has no battery save, and hence no SRAM on board. So how does this work? Well, the same rules apply. With an emulator, let's force it to contain any size SRAM. If the game detects any SRAM other than 0, then it's assumed to be a pirate copy. The game lets you play for a few minutes as normal, but eventually every monster in the game becomes invulnerable. You can't even break the statues and loot items. I flew straight over to the boss fight thinking I could still beat him, but it stops you dead in your tracks. I bet there must have been lots of bad ROM dumps back in the day that would have frustrated many pirates out there. And this is one of those everything seems to work until it doesn't type of game. Another legendary Capcom game on the Super NES is Super Street Fighter II: The New Challengers. This time there are two different anti-piracy measures in place. Like Demon's Crest, the game has no SRAM, but there is a check to determine if a copier is being used. If so, controls are completely disabled. You can press start past the initial Capcom logo, but other than that, the controls are completely removed from the game. You can't do anything, and I was able to confirm this pretty easily with an emulator. The second anti-piracy measure is if the size of the ROM is larger than expected. Super Street Fighter II: The New Challengers comes on a 32 megabit or 8 megabyte cartridge. But like the SRAM check, something that disk copiers will also increase is the size of the ROM in order to compensate for all sizes of games that need to get dumped. So if the game detects a different size ROM other than 32 megabit, the game plays fine for a while, but eventually will end up with a black screen that cannot be recovered from. Okay, so the first two checks aren't too bad, but here's where things get a little crazy. Mega Man X, another game by Capcom, is the first Mega Man game for the 16-bit home consoles and the first game in the Mega Man X series. Written by Keiji Inafune, it recently received a throwback physical release to celebrate Mega Man's 30th anniversary. Mega Man X is brilliant, but the anti-piracy measures in the game can be downright cruel. The game would detect if a copy was running by the usual SRAM checks, and everything would appear to run as normal. However, some of the things you may encounter in the game are, at random you can lose all your upgrades, power-ups can disappear when you move to pick them up, player movement may get random input movement added to it, sometimes you can get teleported back to the start of the level, And if you picked up an extra life, you'd be sent back to the intro stage. And finally, sometimes you would take damage climbing walls. The game detected for the presence of these checks being patched out and would add increased anti-tamper checks, overall making the game impossible to get through. The problem for Capcom was these anti-tamper methods seemed to get triggered on original cartridges as well, causing a lot of headaches and frustration. So Capcom released the 1.1 update to prevent this. The anti-tamper method in Mega Man X is easy to replicate by adjusting SRAM in SNES 90X. Other emulators like the legendary Z-SNES won't work correctly at all with the Mega Man X 1.0 ROM. But in general, most Super NES emulators of today will run Mega Man X 1.0 without any issues at all. Another interesting anti-piracy check is Super Mario AllStars. Just like other games, it uses a similar SRAM method to determine if a copier is being used. But in my experience, attempting to trigger the anti-piracy message does not seem to work when I adjusted the SRAM size in an emulator. In fact, the game runs fine no matter what I did. According to the website The Cutting Room Floor, there's a simple action replay code you can use to trigger the message, but that's not really much fun now, and because we're just patching memory, we're just jumping directly to that screen. So I was determined to understand how this process works better. According to The Cutting Room Floor, the game inserts a value at SRAM location 0 and then another at location hexadecimal 2000. This is where the SRAM mirror lives. Then these values are compared to each other, and if there's any difference, it triggers the anti-piracy message. That seems easy enough to try, but even this does not seem to work. Changing the byte value at hexadecimal 2000 in SRAM has no effect, so I did even more digging. It turns out that the byte comparison is only one part of it. SRAM mirroring is the second part. Let's take a closer look. Inside the ROM itself, there is code that inserts a value at SRAM location 0, then the same value at SRAM hexadecimal 2000. This is the location of SRAM address mirroring for 8 kilobits of SRAM, which is what Super Mario AllStars uses. It first inserts hexadecimal AA at these locations, and then quickly follows it up with hexadecimal 55. I'm assuming it does this as an extra safeguard. The values are then compared with each other, and if they're the same, then the program is allowed to run. And we can confirm this by loading up SNES 90X. We can see that the value hexadecimal AA is written, then quickly followed up with hexadecimal 55. However, if a disk copy was used, the SRAM address mirror would not be at hexadecimal 2000. It might be at hexadecimal 4000, 8000, depending on the size of the SRAM defined with the disk copier, which is usually much larger. So if we patch our emulation code to store the byte hexadecimal 55 at address hexadecimal 4000 to simulate a disk copier, does it trigger the anti-piracy screen? Yes, it does, and finally the mystery is solved. Another thing to mention about this particular check is that inside the ROM itself, this check is done on boot up as well as each individual game. So back in the day, hackers would have to remove the check 5 times in code in order for a working dump to run on a copier. Pretty clever stuff.
Now, there are some games that have documented anti-piracy measures which I believe aren't actually real. And the one that really comes to mind is Chrono Trigger by Squaresoft. Chrono Trigger supposedly has a very interesting anti-piracy measure in place, but it's something that I can't trigger at all.
According to different reports that I've read, Chrono Trigger on the Super NES has a standard SRAM anti-piracy check. It checks for a different amount, which is fairly normal, and if it finds something unexpected, once Chrono enters the time travel machine, he's stuck in an infinite loop during the sequence. Now this check is 100% confirmed on the Nintendo DS version, but on the original Super NES game, I can't get it to trigger no matter what I do. Now I do believe that there must be some anti-tamper measure in place because this was a very big game back in the day, and I do believe that Squaresoft must have been very concerned about the rampant copying that was going on at the time. So I am convinced there must be some anti-tamper measure in place, but I do think it's a little more complicated than just a simple SRAM check. Now, if you happen to know about this, or you've had it happen to you before, please leave a comment below. I'd be very happy to try and see if I can reproduce this one. One last thing to mention is that there are reports of false positives that come up on real cartridges. This is usually when connections are dirty and not making contact, but a simple cleaning of the contact will resolve this issue. But sometimes when you turn off the Super NES console and turn it back too quick, there is a different error that's triggered. In this example, in Donkey Kong Country 3, while not specifically anti-piracy, it still locks the user out of the game. The reason for this is because it takes a few seconds to clear out the Super NES's main memory in its entirety on power down, so powering up the Super NES during this time may result in system memory that's corrupted, and the cartridge may think that some backup or other device is connected to the system. And this one is pretty easy to emulate. Rather than not zeroing out main memory, we just give it some random byte values and then start the emulation. As you can see, this particular method is easily triggered.
So there you have it, guys. That is the anti-piracy on the Super NES. This is kind of the best of the rest, and I really wanted to cover more examples of games rather than just move on to the Nintendo 64, because there are quite a few Super NES games that have this anti-piracy measures in place and different unique methods that the developers took to really mitigate the software piracy that was going on back in the 90s. So as we'll see, the Nintendo 64 really took the anti-piracy stuff to the next level with some more sophisticated and advanced techniques in order to stop the casual copying that was going on. But that will be for another episode. For now, we're going to leave it here. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, you know what to do. Leave me a thumbs up and let me know what you thought about this video in the comments below. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.